Well, good evening and welcome to the South Dakota Agricultural Heritage Museum. Thank you all for coming on this really kind of drizzly day. My name is Gwen McCausland. I'm the director of the South Dakota Agricultural Heritage Museum. I've been here for a lovely 8 years, and I'm really excited because I am also from North Dakota, so a multi-generational, and also grew up in a farm in Ramsey County, North Dakota. So we are excited to welcome you to the opening also of our newest exhibit, Crossroads, Change in Rural America. This exhibit is part of the Smithsonian Museum on Main Street program, and we'll be traveling to 3 other sites across the state. The last site will be in June 2023 at the Fort Sisseton. This exhibit was sponsored by the South Dakota Humanities Council as well as our museum, and focuses on the changes of rural America has seen over the past 100 years in relation to our identity, land, community, persistence, and managing change. Here at the museum, we added to the interpretation and focused on how the South Dakota State University Extension Service has really helped facilitate change in agriculture and rural life across the state. As part of our exhibit opening and the Festival of Books, we are pleased to welcome Sarah Vogel, author of The Farmer's Lawyer, The North Dakota Nine, and The Fight to Save the Family Farm. Sarah is an attorney, advocate, and author who took on a landmark case action suit, Coleman versus Block, against the federal government on behalf of 240,000 family farmers facing foreclosure during the 1980s farm crisis. She has spent her career as an advocate for family farmers, women, and Native Americans. Sarah served 2 terms as the North Dakota Commissioner of Agriculture and was the first woman in U.S. history to be elected to that position in any state. She currently serves as a member of the Agricultural Subcommittee to the USDA Equity Commission and lives in Bismarck, North Dakota. Please join me in welcoming Sarah Vogel to the museum.
Thank you so much. And is this working? Okay. I'm absolutely honored to be here. Just a thrill. I have a few gripes against South Dakota, though. As a North Dakotan, wherever we go, everybody comes to us and says, North Dakota, I've been to North Dakota. I love seeing the Black Hills. And this happens again and again. And we have to say, no, that's South Dakota. And then they sort of stumble around a little bit and back off, and that's the end of the conversation. So now that I've got that resentment out of the way, I will talk a little more about the book and a little bit of history, because we are in a historical, in a museum, and it's about agriculture history. And my book I think my book it's a memoir, but it's also historical. I tried to make it as accurate as possible. I've got footnotes for pretty much everything. And one of the reasons why I wrote it is because as the years went by and times got better, it was not as awful as the 80s were. And I really didn't want it to happen again. And I think that if people in positions that can affect public policy and just normal citizens can be alert for things like overextension of credit and the risks that are endemic in agriculture, that we can prevent another 80s farm crisis from happening. So that's really the reason why I wrote the book, and also one of the reasons why I saved all the papers. I had a big advantage when I wrote the book because I never threw anything away in the 80s. So I had all these draft briefs and letters I got from farmers, and back then in the 80s, I was living in Bismarck at the end of a road with a P.O. box, and I would get mail that said Sarah Vogel, North Dakota. And there were booklets and stuff that were printed for broke farmers, and they would say, legal help, Sarah Vogel, North Dakota. And so people were calling, and it's at the beginning, I think I was much more optimistic. I thought the federal government would step up, would change their ways as soon as they found out what was going wrong. That was delusional, and that didn't happen. And then the case, it became clear that we would have to file a case. And one of the principles in law is that in order to sue the federal government, you have to exhaust administrative remedies before you can go to court. And the administrative remedies at USDA were totally unconstitutional, very, very bad, very, very unfair. And so that became a really important part of the case. And that legacy lives on today in the National Appeals Division of USDA, which provides a fair hearing process. I'm still trying to fix it because they don't let civil rights complaints go into the National Appeals Division. But I think I can get that changed eventually. Anyway, I'm really wandering around here. I'm also kind of delighted. I love agriculture history. I love the Nonpartisan League. The book, I would not have done the case, I would not have written the book, but for the influence I had from the Nonpartisan League. I see a few people going nod, nod, but a lot of people have forgotten about the Nonpartisan League. In North Dakota, the Democratic Party is called the Democratic/Nonpartisan League. But like 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, it was its own political party. It was an independent political party that had a set of principles, a platform, and they would support politicians who supported their platform. And in North Dakota is where it started, but I also have to plug another book. Ta-da! This is a book called Insurgent Democracy, and it's a book about the National Nonpartisan League. And it was published a few years ago by a historian named Michael Lansing, and it has the story about the South Dakota Nonpartisan League. So how many people here from South Dakota know much or anything about the South Dakota Nonpartisan League? Good, because John does. But I'm happy you don't, because then I really want to share. First, in 1919, South Dakota had 20,000 dues-paying members of the Nonpartisan League. 20,000 of them. And the dues were $16. And $16 more than 100 years ago was quite a bit of money. And they followed the same platform basically that the North Dakotans did, which was that farmers should have more control over the markets. They should get the profit from the wheat and the meat and the crops that they grew. They should have access to affordable credit. They should. They had quite a few. They also were. They were one of the first political parties to really embrace the women as members of the political party. They had the women had equal voting rights in the Nonpartisan League. And this is a little tidbit of South Dakota history that I have to share. And it's something I learned just this morning as I was reading through the index of this book for South Dakota, and it's mentioned very often. But anybody ever heard of Alice Lorraine Daly? She's the first candidate for governor that was a woman in the United States, and she was from South Dakota. And she was endorsed by the Nonpartisan League. She came in third. She got 46,000 votes in a year when the League had 25,000 members. So that ain't bad. But she was a suffragette, and and I didn't even know that. I mean, I knew about Jeanette Rankin. She was a nonpartisan leader from Montana who was elected, first woman to be elected to the House. And North Dakota had some heroic nonpartisan league women leaders too. But yeah, I mean, I think that's just pretty remarkable that she was the first woman to run for governor. Yeah, she was the first. Did I say Senate? I meant governor. She ran for governor in 1920. And her campaign motto is too good. It was good housekeeping in government. Much needed. But the League had, in the year about 1920, had 25,000 members. And they had the platform. And at the time, the Nonpartisan League in North Dakota was recruiting pretty heavily in Montana, South Dakota, and Minnesota because they had a plan. And the plan was to capture wheat production, which would in turn give them control over flour, which would mean they could finally get fair prices. And that was a pretty good idea. In North Dakota, they created in 1919 a state-owned mill and elevator, which took a couple years to get up and running, and now they have, they're celebrating their 100th birthday at the state mill in October, and the state mill today is the largest flour mill in the United States, in North America rather, and South America. And it's been consistently profitable all these years, and it's owned by the state. And the most of the flour goes by rail cars to the East Coast. But if you have a bagel in New York City, the odds are very, very good it came from our socialist North Dakota state mill. And it's kind of funny because it is, the state-owned bank of North Dakota, the largest bank in North Dakota. It's an institution, of course. And that also is, state-owned, and at the moment it's run by, all Republicans, and they have no trouble with it. Not at all. And anyway, I just think the Nonpartisan League is just awfully, awfully cool, and it was here in South Dakota. But for the Nonpartisan League, I would not have brought the case or run for office even. And the Nonpartisan League's principle was that government should work for people and not for corporations. And when I was, I moved back to I was from North Dakota. I'd gone to law school out east. I'd been I would call it a consumer protection lawyer when I was on the East Coast. And my last job on the East Coast, I was a special assistant to the Secretary of the Treasury in charge of protecting consumers who had interactions with the Treasury Department, which was rather a big fancy job for one person and a secretary. but that was my job. And I was, when President Carter was defeated and Ronald Reagan was elected, I figured there would not be much opportunity for consumer protection at the Treasury Department. And I moved back home to North Dakota and was in Bismarck. And at that point, I'd come across one farmer, but that farmer told other farmers, and before I knew it, I was at the beginning of the 80s farm depression with farmers calling me, and they were all complaining about an agency called the Farmers Home Administration. It's now called the Farm Services Agency. It's the lending arm. And this was an agency that was set up by FDR to help people, but back then it was turned on its head, and it was by people who didn't approve of the government trying to help farmers. And they were pushing farmers out, and they were doing that because they had the loans, and they had something called supervised bank accounts. And the head of Farmers Home at the time instituted a delinquency reduction goal. And that delinquency reduction goal was they had to reduce delinquencies by 25% and do it in a matter of months. And how do you reduce delinquencies on a farm? I mean, if they send this out in August, there's no crops that are coming in by January or March. You know, there's no way. So farmers were, it came very fast. The crisis came very fast. I wrote a few numbers down. They were in July 31st, 1982, USDA sent 104 acceleration letters. An acceleration meant you maybe had a 40-year loan, but now everything was due in 30 days. 100% of the loan is due in 30 days. South Dakota had 70 of those letters that went out. When they did that, they froze the bank account, seized the money from the bank account, didn't allow another penny for food, payment of electricity, or food for animals even. And it was really something for me, because the pain that it caused farmers who could not feed their animals, it was awful. And the pressure on the farmers was just immense. And it was anyway. And then, and the active borrowers sent acceleration letters prior to July 31st, 1982. North Dakota was 173, and South Dakota was 101. And so they wanted, and the delinquencies were still high, and then they wanted the delinquencies to be reduced by a quarter. So it was like it seemed suddenly, there were farmers all over the state who were like in crisis. And as I said, they called me. And those days I always answered the phone. And as long as anybody wanted to talk, I would talk, because so many people were literally suicidal, hanging on by a thread. And it was, anyway, I still it was hard to write the book because I had to relive a lot of this stuff. And, but because I was a lawyer, because I knew a bit about what had happened in the 30s when the Nonpartisan League was in power in North Dakota. My grandfather had been a leaguer, and I grew up hearing stories about the Langer foreclosure moratorium. And the Langer foreclosure moratorium was an order. It was actually written by a guy named Usher Burdick. And the order said that all of the foreclosures in North Dakota had to stop. And it was like, until times get better. And actually, stuff like this was happening all over the country back then, because it had to, in the 30s it had to. But so I had this model in my mind that that's what you do when this kind of thing is happening. And so I found a law, or we all found a law. There were a lot of farm advocates and people working on this back then. It was a 7 U.S. Code 1981A. That was the legal citation. And it said basically that the Secretary of Agriculture was to allow a deferral of farm payments whenever, due to circumstances beyond the farmer's control, the farmer could not pay USDA without affecting their standard of living. In other words, food, shelter, feed for the cattle. And this was a law that the Reagan administration refused to implement. They said when the secretary may allow a deferral, they said that meant we may follow this law or we may not, and they decided not to. So anyway, long story short, I was working with a lot of farmers, and I decided to do a class action, which I'd never done before, of course, because I'd never been in court before. I was just a book lawyer, an office lawyer, never been to court. My dad, who was a trial lawyer, was having hysterics. He was so scared by what I was planning. And I wanted to do a class action. I wanted to have thousands of farmers. And anyway, he sent me off to a class to learn a little bit about it. But I ended up getting other lawyers to help, and we filed a case in, I think it was March of '83 for North Dakota to get an injunction against USDA until such time as they would follow this deferral law and provide farmers due process of law and stop seizing their income and so forth, and give them the hearing on whether they were right or wrong before they starved the farmer off the farm. And the government resisted it, but we ended up getting an injunction. And by the way, if anybody ever wants to find out a little bit more about the 80s farm crisis and what it was like, you can watch the movie Country by Jessica Lange. It's a phenomenal movie. And during the case, I was sending affidavits to her because her sister Jane was my roommate in college. So Jessica Lange had these affidavits, and she was being taken from farm to farm by rural farm advocates in Iowa. It's true. They're a little bit too nice to USDA, I think. But it's like a documentary. It's an amazing movie. To give away the ending, at the end of the movie, it says it's a teletype of the court order and the national class action, because we brought in all of the states, all but 3, I think. But at the end of the movie Country, there's a AP News story that says, today, a federal judge in North Dakota issued an injunction stopping foreclosures nationwide. And whoa, Anyway, I saw the movie Country when it came out, and I cried through the whole movie, and I couldn't go watch it for another 20 years, but it's a good movie. But I'll tell you a little bit about how it became a national class action. I was scared to bring a national class action, but the lawyers I was working with were willing if I was. And one night, I think it was on a weekend, but it was like 2 a.m, the phone rang, and I always picked up the phone. And the person on the other end, he said he was from Mississippi. He had a thick Mississippi accent. I don't know if he was white or if he was black, but he had that Mississippi accent, and he said that farmers in Mississippi were in terrible trouble, and would I please amend the case to cover other states, not just North Dakota. And I said something like, it's 2 a.m, can you call me at the office tomorrow or Monday? And he said, I don't know if I can make it that long. So when I went back to the office, that made up my mind. And I thought, well, the worst the judge can do to us is say no, and we'll go to another state and we'll do it there. But he did eventually say yes, and he added the protection. And that's how it got to be 245,000. But the subtitle of the book is The North Dakota Nine and the Fight to Save the Family Farm. The North Dakota Nine were my lead plaintiffs. In a class action, you have to have people that exemplify the situation of all of the other people in the class. And I'm just forever grateful to those 9 people who let me tell their stories in the case, who came to the trial, who testified, because no one likes to say, that, hey, I'm getting foreclosed on or evicted or stuff like that. It's deeply shameful, and most farmers and ranchers won't even tell you how many cows they have, much less their troubles. But these 9 said I could tell their story, and the reason why they didn't want it to happen to anyone else. And that's actually the reason why I wrote the book, is because I don't want something like that to happen again. And so I think it, as I, I might, we all have to be, in this setting, when you think about the history of agriculture and how this state and other states were built by farmers and ranchers and how important they are, and the food that we eat. And the pandemic taught us that dependence on worldwide supply is a fool's mission. It just won't happen. So having locally produced food produced by human beings across the U.S. in all locales, I think is a really, really important public policy objective. And that's also part of the reason why I wrote the book. But how long have I been talking? And perhaps there are questions. Okay.
So how initially did the farmer find you? I mean, how did you guys make that connection, since you didn't really have any trial experience or anything that...
Well, I was the only one. I mean, in a way, it was, I was like really, I was passionate about this, and by definition, none of these farmers had a penny. Their bank accounts had been emptied, which did not make them really attractive clients to most other lawyers. But I was fueled by this passion, this nonpartisan league belief, and so I wasn't being at all pragmatic. And I also was very optimistic. I thought that all we had to do is bring these abuses to light, and it would be fixed. But there was a lawyer in Georgia who brought a case on the deferral law first, and she got protections for farmers in Georgia. But that was just the one state, and the government fought that tooth and nail and appealed it, and so they were very, the Department of Justice was huge, and they tried to bury us, but they didn't. And we ended up even years and years later, even getting attorney's fees. The judge, and we had a good judge, my goodness, we had Judge Bruce M. Van Sickle, who is a fabulous, fabulous judge. I talk about him quite a bit. And years later, he's the one who invented the name North Dakota Nine, by the way. I just called them the lead plaintiffs. But many years after the case wrapped up, Judge Van Sickle, when there's no longer any concerns about improprieties and so on, he invited me to lunch, and he said he'd been invited to write a paper for the American Judges Association or something, and wanted me to find out what happened to the North Dakota Nine. And I said, well, who are the North Dakota Nine? And he said, they're your lead plaintiffs. I said, well, where'd that name come from? He said, well, during the trial, I kept thinking about the Chicago Seven. And he said, I think your clients, even though they weren't, they didn't have the crazy hair and the crazy clothes and the crazy behavior, he said, I think your clients were just as brave as the Chicago Seven. And, that's why they are. And at the end of the book, I talk a little bit about where they're at now, and some of them have passed away, but they all kept their farms until they sold them when they wanted to retire or something like that. So it was quite the drama, and but for this case, I would not have run for Secretary of Agriculture. But for the case, but for what I learned as Secretary of Agriculture, I would not have done other things in my legal career. But this case made me the farmer's lawyer. And when you ask how did they find me, who's the farmer's lawyer? And then they'd find me. But it was, I love having farmers as clients. They're the best, absolute best clients ever. Yeah?
Could you tell us how long the case extended and how long did it take to get through the court?
Well, my strategy was to approach them, prepare surreptitiously, because I'd seen the way that they treated other people who went into court who were not fully prepared. The strategy of the Department of Justice was to file a motion to dismiss, wait 60 days, or they would file an answer denying everything, wait 60 days, file a motion to dismiss, and then tie you up in knots over discovery for years and years and years and just wear you out. And that was their strategy, and it worked very well. So what I wanted to do is do all of the preparation ahead of time, prepare the case ahead of time, and then spring it on the Department of Justice. Attack, it's kind of naive to think of, but that was my plan. But to spring it on the Department of Justice and have everything ready to go, like the complaint, the motion, the briefs, the affidavits, and ask for a preliminary injunction right away because constitutional rights were being violated, and have the class certified right away. And that worked because they thought it was just another typical case, and we had them on the ropes actually for quite a while. That isn't that they didn't fight, but from the day we filed it, we had a preliminary injunction like 2 months later. And then we had the Judge Van Sickle. He said, now if there's any amendments at all, I want them for sure in by 60 days from the day 60 days from now, sure, and then it was like way late when I filed a national class action. That was a rather big amendment. But then we built on the record that we had, and the government fought that. But at one point, there were 8 lawyers from the Department of Justice on the other side. But they were playing catch up the whole time. So, but that 1 year was awful. It was very hard. It was hard on the clients because they had to have faith that waiting was the right waiting while this case was being built. At one point, a bunch of them came in to fire me, but they weren't really my clients. But they thought another lawyer promised to do it like next week, and I remember saying, well, you can't fire me because, you're not paying me. And only one of them was my client, and he didn't know that was going to happen. But it was tough, but it was very worthwhile. And the book is like a true life drama, legal John Grisham drama. And when John Grisham's book started to come out, I thought, wow, my case was like a John Grisham book. And when I finished the book and it was going to be published, I wrote an email late at night. My agent found his address, and I thought, nothing ventured, nothing gained. So I wrote an email to John Grisham saying, would you write a blurb for my book? And I sent it off. I thought, I'll never hear back. And 10 minutes later, there was an email. Hi, Sarah, this is John. And he said he would write a blurb. He read it, and he wrote it, and he very gushy. And so that his name is on the cover. And a lot of other people have been very, very supportive of the book. So they say it's a good read, and the only complaint I get is from people who said, I got the book, I couldn't put it down, I was up till 4 in the morning. And I go, yay. But it was hard to prepare.
How long did it take you to write?
Let's define right. I wanted, like, when I knew I had to get out of practicing law full time, because you just cannot write a book and be practicing law full time. So it took me a full year to extricate myself from practicing law, and I thought I'd succeeded, except for the fact that I had another case pending against USDA, which happened to last 20 years. And anyway, so that case I had to keep working on. But then that was when I was 65. I got out of full-time practice of law. And then I dithered around for, I would say, 7 years, because my files were a mess. My filing system was to sweep things off my desk before I got evicted or locked out of my office, and just sweep them in a box. And so that I could not find anything. So I had to organize all these files, and they were over in by that point I got them over in the archives. And then I was like false trails, and then it was trauma. I would try to sit down and write, I couldn't, because I really felt very bad, still do, that I couldn't do more. There were many people who went down in the meantime, and this was just one subset of farmers, and the ones who were borrowing from Farmers Home. Anyway, and then I found a writing coach, and then with the help of the writing coach, who I kind of had assignments, and as a lawyer, we live by deadlines. You have a deadline, so you have to follow it. So that was 3 years. So a long time. Yeah.
So thank you for taking the time to visit us, because you're truly a national leader and a national hero. And from that point of view, what I would love to know is what concerns you today when you look at the agricultural landscape and the political landscape from your history and point of view. What concerns you today?
Okay. I would say it's the long-time absence of antitrust law enforcement. Farmers today are like helpless. They buy all their seed, supplies, fuel from a handful of suppliers, and when it comes time to sell, they may only have 1 or 2 outlets. And the federal government has been negligent in failing to enforce the antitrust laws for a long time. And we have an author, is he still here? He had to go, John Locke, who's written about that. But that's one thing. And then the other thing I worry about today is, who is in charge? Is it the voters? Or is it corporations that have purchased our politicians? And the Citizens United decision, I think, was disastrous. So I think that those are big overarching things, but it's very tough. But I'm very hopeful too. I think the pandemic raised awareness on how important it is that we have local foods, how important it is that we have local processing. Sue Huffman, a person who's written the book Bet the Farm, talks about many of those problems today. And I think it's something that we all have to weigh in on. And what I'm telling people is, if you come across somebody running for the county commission or mayor or House of Representatives or U.S. Senate or president, tell them, I'd love to talk to you about all your policies, but first tell me what you are doing for family farmers. Because I think we have to bring that balance back. So that's the cheater version. I have, at the end of the book, I have, I'm worried about we have many small farmers. It's a struggle, and some are not farmers, they're landlords, they're not farming anymore. So that the count of how many farmers we have, like there it says, and there's been a drop, but in 1940 there were 72,000 farms. Today there are 31,000 farms, or 2019 in South Dakota. But if you do a deeper dive into those numbers like I did in North Dakota, you'll see very few are able to live on what the farm makes. That's a very small percentage. But back in the 30s and 40s, most of the people who were farmers made a living from farming. And so now farmers are very much dependent, I think, on having off-farm sources of income for insurance and other things. Some people would call them the wives. But yeah, that was one of the things I try to convey in this book too, is that farmers are not just men. There were the women who were in this book of the North Dakota Nine. Dwight Coleman was single, but the rest of them were couples, and they took real umbrage at being stiffed at the farmers at the office. They were ignored. Their views weren't heard, and yet they were working as hard as the men, as partners. So I think it's a big, nowadays too, there's a lot of organizations. Tonight, I think, Farm Aid concert. Is that tonight? Tomorrow night? Today and tomorrow. But anyway, Farm Aid has a list of 240 family farm organizations. And so that's another thing I say is if people want to support family farmers, one of the ways to do it would be to give a contribution to one of these organizations that is out fighting the good fight. Farm Aid is one, and then Farm Aid gets it out. National Farmers Union carries on the big burdens of lobbying, but there's many others too, like Family Farm Action. There's a lot. There's a whole lot. I contribute to a lot of them. They found me. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Well, just from a process standpoint, when you were writing, when you eventually wrote the book, then did you go back and involve those North Dakota Nine or involve those clients? And how did you do that?
If I was quoting somebody who was, for the North Dakota Nine, we were all busy. I mean, I would be in touch rarely. Dwight Coleman would come through town every 10 years. Hey, Sarah, how you doing? That kind of thing. But we looked them up, and I shared, we interviewed them and taped them about what they remembered, which was pretty much cracked what I remembered. And then we showed them like the papers and stuff that I still had, and then we recorded all that, and then I tried to use those words. And then at the end of the book, there's quite a bit about the book is the trial that we ended up having, which I thought I wouldn't have a trial, but the feds ambushed me. Anyway, we have the transcript of all of that, and I have all the papers, and I didn't throw anything away, so but yeah, they confirmed pretty much everything that I said and had more insights as well. So they were all very supportive. Unfortunately, some had already passed away, but the ones who are alive, and it is a sweet story. Like Don and Diane McCabe, I was kind of worried, in a way. I wondered, have I ruined their lives? Somebody will say, well, you're the farmer who was facing foreclosure in the 80s. And none of them had that. Don and Diane McCabe, who live in Fargo, they said that's the best thing we ever did in our life. And Dwight had no regrets at all. So none of them had regrets. Russell Falmer, who is the most respectable of all of the North Dakota Nine, he was a really Republican candidate for agriculture commissioner, school board for 24 years. You all know the kind of farmer he was, because he was into the community and supporting everybody. And his family put in his obit, he was a lead plaintiff in the Coleman versus Blackies, along with everything else. So they were proud of what they had done and how many people they had helped. And they didn't regret it, even though there was some retaliation against them and stuff like that by the feds. But nowadays, the people who are at USDA, like Zach Ducheneau, the head of Farm Service Agency, he's bought, because he was pretty careful, he bought a bunch of books, and he's had all of his key staff members read the book, because they don't want it to happen again, which makes me very happy. I guess that's worth writing the book just there. If the head of the Farm Service Agency is saying, we don't want to have this happen again. Knock on wood.
What do you think of the effectiveness of some of these existing family farm-based organizations?
Like I said, I contribute money to a lot of them. And there's some that are specialized, like there's one that just supports better antitrust law enforcement. There's others that are in different states. Some people, there's ones on regenerative, agriculture, organic agriculture. So, one of the things I like is that I think thanks to modern technology, they can all work together. And it's powerful when 150 groups from all over the country write one letter and say, we need better antitrust law enforcement and so on. But what bothers me so much is that, and the senators, they read these letters and they have the staff and so on. But on the other hand, there are many people in Congress who are taking almost, let's call it unlimited money from the corporate agribusinesses that don't want these different protections and so forth for farmers. So I think the farm groups are doing really well. I think Farm Bureau, to be blunt, is not supportive of many of the things I think they should be supportive of. farmers union. You know, you're either one or the other, right? You grow up that way. I'm a farmers union person. So Beth has invited me to speak at the Iowa Farmers Union soon. I did already, never mind. But yeah, they're trying. Everybody's trying really hard. So contributing money to these local groups is also another way of ensuring that voice is there, because they need help, they need support, and because they're battling, you know, basically the forces of darkness. So, and their farmers, I found, are busy. You know, it's hard for a farmer to write letters all the time, but these organizations can do that. So, like I'm very supportive of a lot of them, and they have organizations for dairy and canola and wheat and you name it. So there's many things that can be done. Is that your experience too?
Well, I'm a member of one of them here.
Okay, good. Yes.
At one time, the antitrust laws were used to work against cooperatives, which were mostly rural. Are you concerned that any of those issues will come back to haunt us?
Some of the co-ops are humongous and have forgotten their roots. So I'm worried about everything all the time, actually. And I think we always have to be on our guard. I mean, farmers are being treated as the cash cow of the American economy. Why is it that farmers have this humongous investment and generally make so little? I mean, it's all masked with the massive amounts of government payments, but that makes me feel insecure because it's not coming from the market. It's dependent on political whim. So I think if farmers make more money, that would be good. And antitrust law enforcement. There's a really good book too by Senator Amy Klobuchar on it. It's called Antitrust, and it's got a beautiful history of it and remedies. And John Tester wrote a book, and he talks about antitrust. Cory Booker. I think they're all running for president, but they all talk about antitrust. So it really matters who we put in office, because antitrust law has to starts with the federal government. I'm being hustled off here.
I want to make sure you have time to sign books.
Oh,
so
yeah.
First off, I want to say thank you so much. Please let's give her a round of applause.